Hi, welcome to Regents Roundtable. I'm Stephen Ludwig. My guest today is Scott Van Pelt. I'm very excited. I'm excited about all our interviews, of course, but this is really great. Scott's the Associate Director of the Wharton Communications Program at the Wharton School of the University of Pennsylvania. He is co author of The Great Upheaval: Higher Education's Past, Present, and Uncertain Future. And I absolutely love this book. Highly recommend it wherever you get your books. Pick one of these up, especially if you're interested in higher education, which is why you're listening to this podcast. I've got it all marked up and what have you. It's terrific. And what I think it provides the necessary context to help understand the history of higher education for anyone that's interested in higher ed, but also specifically for trustees and regents, and how higher education has changed over time and the pressures that the institutions are facing now, and a bunch of great insights. Scott, thanks for being here. Thanks for working on such a great book.
Stephen, thanks for the invitation, and I'm so glad to hear that you've enjoyed the book.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to plug your co-author just so we acknowledge that
Of
someone else was
course.
sort of involved in this? Yeah.
It was such a pleasure to work with Dr. Arthur Levine on this book. He and I worked together for about 6 years, digging into just about every trend that you can imagine that either directly or indirectly related to higher education. And we're so thrilled that the product of that work has resonated with a lot of folks in and outside higher education.
Yeah, it's really a great. I just found it very accessible. I've read a lot of higher ed books, and I just like how it was important. It worked for those of us inside and outside the industry. So, if we jump right in, I think one of the challenges that college and university trustees are facing now um, is they don't have a lot of context for, and this isn't their fault. It's just kind of how it. So, and I've also found people in that work in higher ed don't sometimes understand the context of how we got where we are today and where we might be going. And that's why I was excited about the Great Upheaval. And so, before we get into the history of higher education, there's a lot going on demographically today. And I'm hoping we can get a reality check. What are the demographic trends that are facing higher education institutions today?
Yeah, great place to start, Stephen. And I think it's helpful to talk at a macro level around what's going on in the United States, and then drill down to what that means for institutions of higher education. I think there are three categories we could explore here. The first is the way we're changing with respect to the racial and ethnic makeup of our population. Second is the aging of America. And the third is migration patterns within the United States. Uh, and there are
There's
significant
three
changes
three
across
small
all three of those.
three small things. Yeah, three small things. Yeah.
Yeah, really quick, three small items here. Well, for the first one, anyone following demographic change knows that really one of the big stories going on in America now is changing composition with respect to race and ethnicity. And this is driven in no small part by growth in the Hispanic American population. By 2045, more than a quarter of the US population will be Hispanic. There are some states like Florida that are already there, and there are many states that are going to be there before 2045. In terms of age, we're getting older. To sum it up, the 65 and older age demographic is growing as a proportion of total population. We're looking at it being over 20% by that same time frame, 2045. So just think about that. One out of every five Americans will be 65 or older by 2045. And then the younger age groups, conversely, in particular, that 18 to 24-year-old group that we typically associate with college going, that's shrinking, right? And then the last bucket here is migration. And this one is not necessarily a new story. We've seen this playing out since at least 1965. We see generally net losses for the Northeast and the Midwest, and net gains for the West and the Southern regions in the United States. A lot of reasons for why this is going on: high cost of living, people moving due to housing costs, climate is another one. I'm joining you today from my home in New Jersey. We export a lot of people to Florida every year, especially those in that 65 and older
Yeah.
category. And when you look across all three of these dimensions, there are three key takeaways that I think institutional leaders should be cognizant of. The first is that increasingly, this young adult demographic that we've traditionally associated with college going age is going to be comprised of learners from backgrounds that have historically been poorly served by higher education. And I think especially, we're looking at Hispanic Americans in talking about that, a population group that for many reasons, has historically not had equal levels of access to higher education. And even when that access is achieved, the outcomes are not as robust as they are for other groups. And so I think that's important to understand that we need to do better going forward for our students. The second implication here is the implication for the increased proportion of individuals aged 65 and older, and what that means, especially for state institutions of higher education. Uh, Higher education for state institutions is very often in competition for state dollars. It's in competition with K-12 funding. It's in competition with state-sponsored healthcare programs. And when you imagine a reality in which 1 out of every 5 Americans is aged 65 or older, that competition for state funding only gets incredibly fiercer. The last takeaway here for any education providers for whom the primary audience, their primary student base, is that traditional college age student, they're going to struggle to fill seats, especially in the Midwest and the Northeast. And this isn't necessarily a new story. We've seen reports coming out of closures, of mergers, of institutions looking to engage in shared services to reduce their operating costs because they can't fill seats the way they used to. So these are the three things that we see playing out on the demographic front, and these are not going anywhere anytime soon.
Yeah, and those are really we could probably do a podcast individually on each one of those because they're so profound. I'm going to inject some thoughts here around from a stabilization of democracy. We've seen challenges going on for democracy already. My concern is I live in Colorado. Our Hispanic population is growing. As you mentioned, the higher education attainment rate is not equal with others and the majority population. And I think from yes, there's a social equity conversation there, but there's also just a pragmatic one, right? If we by 2045 or 2050 or what have you have a majority of white people with college degrees and a disproportionate few people from Hispanic populations without, and that power shift is just a destabilizing thing from a democracy and business point of view. And I think we've given a lot of lip service to that so far. And that's something that I know institutions are going to have to grapple with, and we want them to grapple with, right? Because it's a very important thing. Um, when I started, you mentioned the Northeast and Midwest is having a challenge with the traditional age students. When I started as a regent in Colorado, we had about 15 full-time people located in this state that were recruiting for colleges that were out of state. And now there's close to 60. So clearly there's this massive increase for competition for students. Some are private institutions, some are public institutions. That's just a lot of competition. And demographically, Colorado was late to, there were fewer 18-year-olds graduating from graduating from high school in other parts of the country. Colorado was later to that. So that's why they're coming here. But what are the implications with this increased competition?
Well, competition is coming from both inside and outside traditional higher education, Stephen. I mean,
Oh, great. Yeah.
Colorado is
Hmm.
it's one of the fastest growing states in the nation. I think it's still top 10, at least as of the past couple of years. So I wouldn't be surprised to learn that recruiters are looking to draw students from Colorado to states or to institutions in states that don't have that same expectation of continued growth. But Stephen, one thing I think that's important to highlight is again this idea that competition for learners is a more complex topic now than it may have been in the past. And the reason for that is that the entrance of non traditional distributors and providers of education into the higher education space has really picked up over the past decade. I'll give you a few examples, and I'll start with one that most of your listeners are probably at least somewhat familiar with. 10 years ago, Coursera started up, and after just a few years, they'd grown to 28 million learners. As of last year, they have 92 million, with
Wow.
17 million alone coming from the US. Now, let me put that into context. 17 million. That is almost the equivalent of the full time undergraduate enrollment in the United States today. And this is all occurring amidst, not in a vacuum, right? It's occurring during a pandemic, a global pandemic that's forcing learners to really reevaluate how they engage with their learning experiences. So during this time period, 2020 to 2021, even as institutions, traditional institutions around the country are facing steep enrollment declines, close to 15% for community colleges in particular. Coursera sees a 30% increase in registered learners. All right. So we're not just talking about new distribution platforms, though. We're talking about new education providers as well. Google, of all places, now offers certifications in IT support and data analytics and project management. These are completely online. They're self paced, they cost $50 a month. And after a student achieves one of these certifications, Google considers it the equivalent of a college degree. And they've partnered with 150 other employers to find gainful employment for the learners who are achieving these certifications. And that's just more vocationally oriented programs. That's not the end. That's not the end of the story. We have providers like the American Natural History Museum, which for some time now has offered a PhD in comparative biology and a Master of Arts in teaching. Meanwhile, you've got the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which through Coursera is offering certifications and certificates in things like contemporary art and post war abstract painting. So, long story short, the definition of competitor in higher education has really shifted and expanded. And that's something that I think not everyone is quite aware of quite yet, but it's important to factor in when thinking about what we mean by competition for students.
I that's super helpful. I think a lot of trustees and regents, they're probably going off of what it was like when they went to college, which again, not they're it's not their profession. I think the number I heard is 15% of trustees and regents have a background in higher ed,
Mhm.
so a lot of this information will be new. And one of the things that I remember us talking about quite a bit, in addition to what you're sharing, is this idea that I take that class from Google, I take a class from someone else, and I start credential stacking on my LinkedIn profile, right? As a way to either augment my degree or just bypass that in general. One of the things that I didn't know, and this goes back to the competition thing. When I
Mhm.
read your book, I didn't get, and we mentioned it briefly, how much geography is playing a part in the challenges facing college and university enrollments. And once you explain it, it's like, well, of course that makes sense, but it never occurred to me. There are reports that say about 58% of students attend a college within 100 miles of their home, while 72% attend an in-state institution. With that understanding, your research has found that there's an oversupply of colleges in the northeastern part of the United States. What does that mean for colleges and universities there? In addition to what you already just shared about, we've got all this other non-traditional competition happening.
I mean, in short, Stephen, it means that we have a large number of institutions competing for a shrinking number of students in their geography. In economic terms, we have far more supply than we expect to have demand. Now, some colleges have adopted new models to address this head on. I think a perfect example is what we saw happen at Southern New Hampshire University and their College for America initiative. Leadership there saw the writing on the wall and moved aggressively to a new model. And within a relatively short period of time, within the grand scheme of higher education, you saw an institution that had been a little known undergraduate institution in the Northeast quickly become one of the largest providers of online education in the country. At this point, they're well over 100,000 enrollments. But here's the thing, there's only room for so many Southern New Hampshire universities in the world. So, what does that mean for the rest of us? A few things come to mind here, but one I'll just touch on for now, Stephen, is I think it means that we need to broaden what we mean by student or learner. This might be old news to some of your listeners, but the traditional learner, that 18 to 22-year-old who's living on a dorm on campus, that's not the majority student. It hasn't been for some time. And when Arthur and I delved into this topic, the takeaway that we left with was that lifelong learning is really the wave of the future here. And you hear that said and thrown around a lot, lifelong learning, continuing education. But I think it's important to understand what's driving that and where it comes from. And there are two things in particular that I think are worth surfacing. Two forces in particular, rather. And the first is the declining half life of knowledge. And the second is the impact of automation on job skills. There's a quote that I love to bring up whenever I talk on this topic. It's from what was formerly the American Society of Training and Documentation. It's now the Association for Talent Development, largest talent development society in the world. And they quoted, half of what is known today was not known 10 years ago. And the amount of knowledge in the world is doubling every 18 months. Here's the terrifying part about that quote. It's 20 years old today. The rate of change is just so much faster now than it was back then. I was doing some work with a medical education center not too long ago, and in preparation for that work, I came across a study in which researchers estimated that the current time that it takes for the amount of knowledge to double, at least in the medical field, it's down to just 73 days. All right. So knowledge is becoming out of date more quickly than ever before. And our current education infrastructure just it's not designed to react in kind. But
Right.
I think the bigger story here is around automation. A lot of people have probably seen the studies out of McKinsey or similar organizations that note that um, as much as half of the time that we spend on job tasks today could be automated away within the next 10 to 20 years. And when we think
Not
about
not
automation,
not not podcasts, I hope.
I think
Not right.
pretty safe. You know,
We'll see.
keep up this
Well,
quiet,
actually,
you're safe.
AI hosts are coming. I know it. AI guests will be there next. So, but I interrupted. Please continue.
No, not at all. The thing about automation is when we talk about it, a lot of us tend to think about low skill jobs or jobs we might call low skill. But in reality, automation is going to be impacting jobs in fields as wide ranging as accounting, law, and medicine. It's already happening. Um, and COVID has already accelerated this time frame. People were saying 10 to 20 years for a lot of this automation to take place. A lot of the estimates that I've seen more recently are saying the pandemic has accelerated the time frame by about 3 to 5 years.
Mhm.
And here's the thing about automation. It's a complicated beast, right? Because automation is not simply about an entire role or a job going away because a piece of code can do it or a robot can do it now. It's more so about the ways in which jobs evolve and new tasks come up as a result of automation. And so, what that means for those of us working in higher education is that we need to be aware of the impact of automation on the skills that our learners need. And in particular, the challenge that we have is in ensuring that those individuals whose opportunities might have been negatively impacted by automation, that they have the opportunity to reskill or upskill in a timely manner so that they can get back into the workforce in a meaningful way. And that's something that people are likely going to have to do multiple times throughout their lives. Education is not a one and done affair. I'm 22 years old, I have my degree, I'm good to go now. No, this is something that people are going to be looking to engage in throughout their entire lives. And so that's a shift in how we think about what a college education is and what post secondary or higher education is or can be. And the opportunity for institutions, I think, is to meet that need that people from all backgrounds and all ages are going to have for upskilling and reskilling at multiple points throughout their lives.
It's interesting, and we're going to get a little bit more into this, but higher education seems to double down when things get hard on the way things used to be. And you made an argument in your book, which I thought was really interesting, is that the smaller institutions, the more vulnerable institutions, will be the ones where the most interesting experimentations take place. And then once those have proven out, the bigger institutions, the bigger brands, the bigger names will adopt the winners of that.
Mhm.
But for the vulnerable institutions, and I feel bad that people lose their jobs in these small liberal arts colleges that have amazing histories and do amazing, but it's like these trends are not new. Um, but it always seems like, oh, we're surprised we're closing. What happened? It's like, well, it wasn't COVID. COVID sort of pushed you over the straw that broke the camel's back, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a question in that, but what do you think about like our inability to just get out of this mental framework we're stuck in about nope, we educate 18 to 22-year-olds. That's who goes to college. Anything else is icky. A working adult is icky. It's the bottom feeders. It's not the best and the brightest, that nonsense. I mean, we're just sort of stuck.
Yeah, and I find it so apt and interesting, Stephen, that you point out that this isn't new. There was a little historical segue here, but there was a committee on education and workforce development that was appointed to look at the impact of automation and what it meant for the United States and what we needed to do about that. And among other recommendations that this presidential committee put together was that we needed a K-14 system of higher education. We needed free community college, and we needed an infrastructure for lifelong learning because automation was going to create this need for upskilling and reskilling. So that committee, that's not a recent thing. That was under President Johnson, I think, back in 1965. You hear some of the things there: automation and what
Mhm.
it demands of us, free community college. We're talking about these things today still as though they're new
Wow.
ideas, Stephen, and they're not. They're decades old. So, in terms of how we get out of that, I don't have an easy answer to that. I've met with a lot of college leaders and organizational leaders who are, at minimum, looking to get people in their industry, people in their organization, rather, at least on the same page around what's happening outside their institutions and how
Mhm.
it's going to impact the operations of their institution.
Right.
For some time, I think higher education has been insulated. There's been some regulatory protection that higher education has enjoyed. Also, the rate of change has been, at least in past decades, sufficiently slow that institutions have been able to adapt by means of piecemeal reforms. Today, though, I think the challenge is that we have a number of people who think that we can continue business as usual. We can continue adapting by means of piecemeal reforms. And for some institutions, that might work. But for a lot of other institutions, the rate of change is sufficiently fast that we can no longer afford to simply be reactive. We need to
Mhm.
look at what's going on, look at how this is going to be hitting our institutions in the years to come, and be more proactive in the changes that we make to how we educate students and how we run our organizations.
It was interesting. I saw some stories and met some individuals from around the country that their response to, oh, our state funding is going down. Let's stand up our online programs so we can feed the pig.
Mhm.
And I'm like, I've been an advocate for online education because I don't think that an individual should have to prostrate themselves on campus to get an education, especially with technology the way it is, especially for public institutions. It should be part of our mission. But again, those icky working adults, we don't like them. Um, and I was almost offended, like, oh, you're adopting this change because your budget is hurting, not because it's the right thing to do or this is part of your mission. So that's been very challenging, and it's interesting. Are there strategies that board members that you could think of at institutions are at the, like, if they're in the wrong part of the country or at the wrong part of the demographic trends, which is kind of the same thing. Like, do you think there's some strategies they should think of as like, oh my gosh, there's all this stuff coming at us?
Yes, I have good news and maybe bad news there as well, Stephen. And the bad news is that the demographic trend is not the only thing that we can be on the wrong end of. But for those let's start with demographics because that is an important one. I think that institutions really need to think about how they distinguish themselves. We need unique value propositions, something of
No,
value that.
I want to be just like the one down the road. I want to get my ranking in US. I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little negative today. I apologize. Please continue. You're the expert. I'm just spouting off opinions.
No, not at all. I'm right there with you.
Yep.
I think that trend towards looking to be similar to the highly ranked institutions is really doing us a disservice. We need distinction. We need something of value that our institutions do that others don't, or something that we do better than any other institution. And I don't mean, oh, we have a rock wall or a lazy river. I mean, we have robust industry partnerships. We
Mhm,
have a unique industry focus. We have a unique
mhm.
approach to teaching and learning with a proven success. The other thing that I think we can do, Stephen, and this goes back to the point we were talking about earlier, we need to expand the definition of learner. Today, many institutions have those programs. They call them continuing ed or executive ed. They often exist on the periphery, though. They're not the prestigious programs. They're not the ones that are front and center on the website. In many cases, they're treated as an afterthought. They're not front and center right now, but they will need to be because if we're looking at where the new majority of learners exists, that's where they are. They are continuing education. They are lifelong education. And that's where the need is going to be.
Yeah. So
But
let's
one other thing I'll say here, Stephen, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
no, please. I interrupted you. Yeah, yeah.
another thing that we need to be cognizant of around this idea of being on the wrong end of things. I mentioned automation and the half life of knowledge. And these things, these forces, they're going to drive not only a surge in lifelong learning, they're going to drive a demand for certain kinds of learning. And this is where we get into the idea of changing consumer preferences. And I know we don't always like to use the word consumer when we're talking about students. I get that, but it's a useful lens here. A lot of the new non-traditional providers that are entering the higher ed space right now, they're bringing something that traditional institutions have not always been successful at, and that's flexible, low cost access, on demand access to content and learning. So let's say you're a leader at a tuition dependent college in the Northeast or Midwest. You're looking at this demographic picture. To your point, Stephen, you're looking at this budgetary picture, and you might think, well, let's explore online learning. We can do something with that. We have some computer science offerings that might be a good fit here. Here's the problem: Google has already beat you to it. And if I'm a student and I'm thinking about going into some sort of tech field, I can choose between whatever my local institution is offering, whether that's in person or online, or I can look at this new low cost, flexible thing that an industry leader has created and which seems to offer a reliable on ramp to gainful employment. So in planning for the future, be aware of competition. I'm not advocating that Google's approach is the right way to do education. What I'm advocating for is rather that if you're working at an institution and you're thinking about what you need to do moving forward, be aware that the definition of competition is broader today than it's ever been before.
So I have two thoughts on this. One is I always felt like the University of Phoenix, which serves its purpose, wouldn't exist if public colleges and universities had a broader understanding of what their job actually was.
Mhm.
And so what Phoenix figured out and other for-profit colleges is where are higher education, where are they weak? Where are the traditional? It's like, well, we make you come to us. We act like we're doing you a favor by admitting you. We don't really make you feel wanted. If you get here, it's right. All those things. And Phoenix figured all that out. And so now, if we expand that idea of where are we weak, what you just described are you have to come to us. It has to be at a prescribed time. It's not asynchronous. All those things where we don't do well, the Coursera's and the others and Google's and the other providers that are providing credentials have figured all that out. They've counter programmed to us.
Mhm.
And so that's a thing that we're really slow to catch on. But the other thing that's interesting is this half life of knowledge. I have a degree in philosophy, and people go, "What's up with that?" And I'm like, "Well, I had a career. I was a non-traditional student. I wouldn't trade my philosophy degree for anything because it's allowed me the flexibility to learn new things, pick up new knowledge. It gave me the skill of writing and thinking and critical thinking. And I'm curious if you, as we go through a more credentialed stacked credential approach, I wonder if that liberal arts thing could be more valuable for people like, oh, you do this half life of knowledge is really short, but what you learn in that liberal arts thing can help you be a self generating learner for the rest of your life.
I think there's a lot to that, Stephen. I mean, remember, one of Coursera's top rated courses was something along the lines of learning how to learn, because there's definitely a need for that. So I think that skill of knowing how to learn, it's critical, and it's something that I want to make sure that we don't lose. In fact, that's probably one of my top worries as we do see more of these non-traditional uh, providers entering the space is, well, to what degree are they offering that for learners who haven't had that experience quite yet? Because the
Mm.
last thing we want to see happen is the creation of a two-tiered track of education where you have the haves who have the privilege and the ability to undertake an educational experience where they grapple with these difficult concepts. They learn how to learn. They tackle critical thinking. They tackle intercultural competency. They get all of these wonderful learning experiences. And then a second track for the have-nots that's simply vocational, pretty much online, flexible, low cost. Yes, all of that. And yes, it leads to gainful employment, but But the question then is, well, what's missing? And how have those students been done a disservice because they weren't given the opportunity to have that exposure, to have that learning experience that you're talking about, Stephen?
I think that's an absolutely critical conversation, that two-tiered approach. So I mentioned earlier mental frameworks. And so let's shift into a talk about history. People think that colleges and universities, it's really interesting. It's like, well, they've always been the way they are today. It's like, well, of course that's not true. And I love explaining to people that an individual is not considered educated if they couldn't read and write Latin and Greek. And so this just says, look, we evolve. We understand things in a new way. We change our ideas. Can you explain in very broad terms? And this is actually a very unfair question, but I'm sure you'll give it a shot. The evolution of higher education, let's say the 1850s to today. I'm sure that's really easy to do.
1850. You want to start at
It's
1849? We can flex.
1830, 1833 would be better.
Um, well, Stephen, I'm sure I don't need to say this to you, but I'll preface it by saying that we could spend an entire podcast series.
Easy
I'm sure someone probably has
series. Yeah, yeah.
on the history of higher ed. And for anyone interested in the topic, especially people who might be new to higher education but are supporting it in some kind of leadership capacity, books like John Thielen's A History of American Higher Education, that's really essential reading. And I'd encourage everybody to delve into that. But you're right, higher
It's a
education,
little dry. Good book, a little
a
dry.
little dry, but
Yeah,
really
good book. Yeah,
thorough,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
well
Very.
researched.
Yeah.
But higher education as we know it today, it didn't exist back in 1850. We had a focus on moral education. People were studying on any given day Latin, Greek, botany, astronomy. Higher education as an entity, it did not resemble what we call higher education today. And the other thing, which is a critical thread that we'll explore throughout all of higher ed history, is there wasn't a lot of standardization either as we know it today. Now, things start to pick up a little bit in the latter part of the 19th century. It's really post Civil War era that America and higher education correspondingly really start to explode. We are expanding across the entire country. We're building railroads. We are undergoing a transformation in the form of the Industrial Revolution that places new demands on what people need to know. So we have a bigger focus on science, and that filters in to what higher education becomes. It's also during this time in the latter part of the 19th century, early part of the 20th century, that we start to see the emergence of institutional types that would look a little bit more familiar to us today. So, land grant colleges, more HBCUs, community colleges. And we also start to see more in the way of standardization. I'll share an extended, but I think interesting anecdote because it encapsulates some of the ways in which standardization is a bit of a messy process. So let me take you back to around 1905. And Andrew Carnegie, who most of us would know from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, he had a mission. He was looking at higher education, he was looking at faculty, and he felt that these professors are not really well taken care of. This is such a critical role. It's a critical job. But after they retire, they're destitute. They're not really being given the support they deserve. So he wanted to create a pension system for faculty. Great. So he starts off with $10 million of his own money. A lot of money at the time, but not enough to design and fund a pension for every person teaching at colleges and universities at the time. So he needs criteria. He needs criteria to figure out which institutions will be eligible to have their faculty covered by this pension. And the first criteria that he arrives at is, well, if an institution is going to be eligible, they should have admission requirements. It's 1905. We don't really have admission. There are no standardized admission requirements. High schools don't even have standardized graduation requirements at this time. So in New York, though, one thing they're doing is at this time is they're using something called counts. And these counts measure student progress and achievement, with one count being roughly equal to 10 weeks of study for 5 days a week. Well, Carnegie latches onto this idea. It gets developed further, and they end up creating a unit that equates to 120 hours of instruction. And if institutions want to participate in this pension system, they need to require a certain number of units as a condition of admission for their students. Well, if you're an institution, what do? It's free money on the table. You jump on it. Of course, you adopt this standard. And within just a few years, people start to figure out that the Carnegie unit can be really useful for all kinds of academic transactions, not just in the US, but globally. It ends up getting used to measure teaching loads, student progress, building operations, and institutional expenses. And none of this was ever its original purpose. The Carnegie unit is more commonly known today as the credit hour, and it functions much the same way as it did now in the first decade of the 20th century. And it came about because Carnegie wanted to fund a teacher pension system. Now, I mention this partly because I think it's a fun historical anecdote, but mainly because it shows that things that we take for granted today, they come about in ways that might not have the intentionality that we'd assume is there when it comes to standardization. Um, that gets us now into the 20th century. We're getting closer to modern day. And we start to see the massification of higher education after this. And massification is just a fancy word meaning that higher ed is increasingly less something that's reserved for the elite and more so something that's open to a broader population. And this really comes to a head with the Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944. We have millions of soldiers returning from overseas as the war concludes. And we want to give opportunity to these returning soldiers. And so this act creates funding for millions of new students to enter higher education. As we get further into the
Is,
20th
is that
century,
is that commonly known as the GI Bill?
that's probably how most people would be familiar with it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, please
But if you're
continue. Sorry to interrupt. Yeah,
looking for the
yeah,
Wikipedia article,
yeah.
might show up under Servicemen Readjustment Act of 1944. So that's really where we start to see more people coming into higher education, and it starts this trend as we get later into the 20th century of bringing more people into the fold. We see greater access, in particular for populations that had been excluded from higher ed, especially African Americans. And you mentioned earlier, Stephen, state funding. So I'll mention this thing too because I think it's relevant. Around 1990, and we skipped a few decades, around 1990, something changes in higher ed, especially publicly funded higher education. In the fiscal year from 89 to 90, state appropriations for public higher ed, they're at all-time high, historic high. Well, what happens after that? First, the United States enters a recession. Second, competition for public dollars explodes, largely driven by expanded eligibility for Medicaid. We were talking earlier about competition for state dollars. This is really where that increases in intensity. And for the next 30 years, continuing until today, state support for higher ed never again reaches those levels that we'd seen in the 80s and early 90s. And today, Stephen, I mean, higher ed is marked by any number of challenges. And I'm sure your listeners are familiar with many of them. Falling state support has been one driver of tuition increases. There are multiple drivers. That's one of them at the public level. And if you're listening to this, I don't need to tell you how much of an issue student debt has become. And now here we are today, and we're at another inflection point. The future of higher ed that Arthur and I were looking at, it's one in which we're going to need to explore new structures to serve the needs of a changing economy. The industrial economy, that's behind us. We're transitioning to a global knowledge-based economy. And what that means it means that some of the artifacts of the industrial age, things like the credit hour, they're going to be replaced by something new.
So the reason, thank you for taking the time to one summarize that so well so quickly, and the anecdote about Carnegie is incredibly important because law of unintended consequences, and we're still dealing with that. The reason I'd like you sharing that, one, I'm just fascinated by the history of higher ed, but two, it's to help trustees and regents go, people made decisions in the past
Mhm.
that got us to where we are today, which means we can make new decisions today to get us somewhere else we want to be. And that's the
Exactly.
like, and people argue that no, that's not what higher education is or is not supposed to be. It's like, well, we made that up and we can make up something new if that's what's required to continue to fulfill a private institutions mission or a public institutions mission to serve the public. Now, we're about out of time, and this has been a fascinating conversation. I know we could talk for a few more hours, But I always like to ask my guests, one, was there anything you wanted to mention that we didn't get a chance to cover? I
I
know
think
we had to cut some things out that we talked about previously.
no, of course. I think one area that I'd encourage everyone in a position of leadership to consider going forward is exactly what you're saying, Stephen. The ways that higher education needs to change to meet the needs of a changing economy, and in particular, we need to be looking at things like self-paced learning and competency-based education. We're in a great state of experimentation right now. There are very few proven models, if any, that we can scale up and standardize at this point. We're really at the beginning stages of the process of change, and higher ed has undergone this process of change before. We get to do it again now, and we get to develop models that will serve the needs of learners going forward.
I think the key there, I amen to that, and I think the key there is serving learners. I
Mhm.
think the mental trap we get into, especially on as board members, is our job is to protect the institution. And I always felt like my job as a regent was to be sure the institution serves the people it's supposed to serve the best way it can. So it's a slight difference, but it's that framework of what are we all about? Are we about making sure our campus looks beautiful forever, that our faculty continue to do what they do forever, or is to make sure that we serve the people we're supposed to serve? I'm very mission focused, and that was always my point. Last question. What do you like most about working in higher education?
Oh, I love to end on that one, Stephen. Whew. Well, my day job, I'm an educator. I teach and roll out a curriculum to about 1,000 students every year, and I try my best to keep in mind the privilege of my position, and not to be grandiose here, but I do feel that every day I get to contribute to the learning of those who might go on to lead organizations, run businesses, create startups, or new nonprofits that serve the needs of their communities. And it really is a privilege to play even a small role in helping these learners realize their potential. I think that's something that all of us in higher ed get to enjoy, not just those in teaching and learning, but everyone from admissions to student affairs practitioners to career counselors to trustees. We're all here to help learners realize their potential in one way or another. And I think being a part of that process is really a gift.
I, I love it. Love it. I always felt like the higher education, we were in the life transformation business.
Mhm.
And I love the way you articulated that. Scott, thank you so much again. The Great Upheaval, great book. Pick it up wherever you get your books. Scott, this is a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for taking time to speak with us. Speak with me today. There's no us.
Thanks so much,
Or
Stephen. It was
us,
a lot of
the audience. So thank you so much.
Thank
All
you
right.
so much.
Take care.